Welcome to our panel. We'll be discussing whether democracy can keep up with the pace of technology. My name is Dr. Raman Chowdhury, and I'm the responsible AI lead at Accenture, and I have an extremely illustrious panel with me, and thank you to the audience for joining us. So we've had quite a few democratic challenges, I'll put it lightly, over the past year or so when it comes to technology. And it's nothing new in the world of business. We have seen this impact on industry, on businesses, appreciating that really changes the new norm, and artificial intelligence is bringing in new and different things. So, are we seeing this ripple effect from business to society and into democracy? And how do you think this has been manifesting itself? And I'll open that to whoever would like to answer. Josh, I believe you basically published a book on this.
It's very interesting. Obviously, there is a parallel between what our current concerns are around technology and democracy with respect to where much effort is going in business in terms of being able to understand consumers. So it is not a very long line to draw from targeted advertising to persuasive manipulation of entire populations. And I think that's where the links between the two really come in. The question we're going to face with democracy is the same as we face with advertising. Is it good or is it bad? Because it's basically the same process. Is it informative or is it manipulative by people who are in power?
Kay, do you have any thoughts?
I was just going to say one of the things that we're doing at the forum is we're in the scoping phase of looking at the impact of artificially intelligent enabled toys on our children. So thinking about, we know, for example, that 0 to 5, 0 to 7 is a very influential period when children are creating their value system. If you think of that old hierarchy of value, attitudes and beliefs and attitudes, that's when they're creating those core things. And so we're wondering about the messages that children could be receiving at that age, and who is going to be giving that messaging. And we're also wondering about in places in the world and democracies in the world where perhaps they don't have the GDP, what happens to all the collected data about children from the moment that they open their mouths and start talking to these toys, and how that could be used to influence voting. And then we get back to, how much information and data do you have about a person that could be used to either sell or manipulate a particular the voting structure.
I share Kay's concern, but I also think that this is very much a here and now issue. And I agree with Joshua. This is really an extension of what business has been trying to do, the kind of holy grail of micro-targeting, personalized advertising. But in the context of democracy, it's particularly chilling because it's not transparent. And although in the past, we've targeted in terms of demographics, the broad mosaic data or whatever. What we haven't seen until, if you like, the Cambridge Analytica scandal has been political targeting personalized in this kind of way. And if you don't know that's happening to you, and there isn't a level of digital understanding throughout our country and most Western democracies, that is really pretty sinister. So I think we've got quite a long way to go, A, before we understand exactly what's happening, and B, before we are able to regulate effectively.
So do you think the British democratic institutions are prepared for this onslaught of technological hyper-personalization, manipulation, whatever you want to call it? And then maybe to the other two members of the panel as well, what about the global markets?
Well, certainly in the UK, I mean, at the very last minute with the Data Protection Bill, now the Data Protection Act, we had to insert new powers for the Information Commissioner to be able to enter the premises of Cambridge Analytica and others like it in short order. Most of the regulators have the power just to walk into your premises if they think there's a breach, a major breach of some particular regulation. The Information Commissioner had no powers to do that. She had to wait for 7 days before getting into Cambridge Analytica. That will be possible in the future. And I think it sounds draconian, but those kinds of powers are extremely important.
And Kay, what are the challenges and balances we have to do maybe in the global market where these companies, frankly, have power that supersedes any individual government? So what can maybe an organization like the World Economic Forum do, and what can international governments do?
So I think the World Economic Forum works with governments and businesses, civil society and academia on all of its projects. And one of the things that we are doing is working with governments around the world in partnership to create policy. And those governments actually pilot the policy that we co-create. So within the next year or so, you will be seeing a number of pilots around AI governance happening around the world, which we at the Forum have co-created with our government partners. But I just wanted to sort of mention something that happened at a conference that I spoke at in China 2 weeks ago, because I think it shows that it's not just democracy that is worried about this. So one of the CEOs had shown a piece of video that had Donald Trump perfectly in Chinese appearing to welcome everybody to the conference. And so this, of course, caused a great ripple of laughter. But immediately following that CEO was another CEO who said, I run a cybersecurity company using artificial intelligence. And although you find that really funny because it looked exactly, perfectly as if Donald Trump was speaking Chinese, can you imagine what the reaction would have been if you had done exactly the same thing to one of the party leaders in China? And so I think that it's not just democracy that is concerned about the ability to manipulate, and particularly that combination of being able to change video and use the accent, the perfect accent of the person, and put words in the mouth.
Deepfakes are an excellent example. So then, Joshua, who do you think then might hold the responsibility for this? The corporations or governments? Is it just unidirectional?
So let me just, for the sake of argument, try and be optimistic about all this. So there is the argument, and it's very easy to see it, whereby AI or some technology does something nefarious and bad. Those examples are that. Obviously, once that occurs, and once people know it occurs, they just tend to distrust the entire medium. No one will trust a video of anything. And so we'll be back to the world at which we're trying to verify it, and people will understand some verified source. But imagine that we solve that problem. And I know that's a big ask in today's world. I've just come from, I live in Canada, and it feels again like 1812 there. But basically, what you could have is a situation like there's a startup that came out of the University of Toronto called, that runs a product called Vote Compass. I believe you would have seen it here, where some media organizations have it, and you can put in information about your policy preferences, etc., and it tells you for a given election who they think you should be voting for. If you have the right underlying data from that, what you'd be able to do is have consumers, or have voters work out what they want in policies, and then it tells you who you should be looking at, who is really doing the things that you're after. And so that could be quite empowering in many ways. I mean, that could be a truth engine if you had that underlying core of information verified and honest.
Thank you. So, and maybe to continue on this sort of contrary to what we've been talking about theme, you know, technology has always been a bit of a disruptive force. I recall as a political science grad student reading this really great paper about the first televised US political election debates, and it was Nixon versus Kennedy. And it was one of those cases where, you know, video killed the radio star. When, you know, Nixon had been known for being a great speaker and great orator, but when people saw him next to the dashing young Kennedy, looking old and cranky and sweaty, it actually impacted his popularity rating. So why is this any different? So agreed, this is a little bit different from deep fakes, but, you know, why should image or perception even matter? Let's say in politics, it should be about content, one might argue, but that is the space we live in. It can be a bit of a popularity contest.
I think AI is different because it is more inherently manipulable by humans. And after all, it's not the AI that's the problem here, it's the humans. And that's why what we've got to do is have an ethical framework that makes sure that AI and other technologies, and it isn't just AI, it could be blockchain, could be IoT, could be a range of other technologies that are used for human benefit, that are transparent, that are explainable, that are free of bias and so on. I mean, we have to actually adopt human values when we are using AI. And this is, I think, what we've got to keep emphasizing. Technology is not value-free. It is what we humans impart to it. And whether that's in our democratic processes, whether it's in business practice, you know, we have to sort of preach that gospel, if you like. And strangely enough, I've found very few tech companies who object to that message.
Absolutely. And Kay, I think we're now squarely in your wheelhouse. The World Economic Forum has been driving a lot of that narrative about infusing the human values. Can you talk a bit about your thoughts on how this fits in with this concept of democratic institutions?
Yes, so certainly the forum, so any project that we do out of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is based in San Francisco, has to have a ethics and values, social inclusion, and human-centered perspective to it. So all of the work that we're doing is around making sure, and the work that I'm doing in artificial intelligence is making sure that the underpinnings of this technology are correctly governed and regulated. So thinking about the ethical piece, for example, what are the policies that we need to put in place around bias, around transparency, around privacy? So all of those underpinning pieces, that getting the artificial intelligence right before we all dash off to market and sell products on something that isn't fundamentally attributable to our value systems, and that depends upon what your value systems are around the world. And so one of the great things that the forum is able to do is obviously work with governments around the world with their culturally appropriate ethics and value systems as well.
One of the key words in all of this, I think, is design. What you have to actually do is think ahead. It isn't going to be good enough simply to say, oh, well, by the way, those existing algorithms, you know, we need to make sure that they're explainable, free of bias, and so on and so forth. Every, you know, developer, researcher has to think ahead and think, how do I design this in accordance with a set of ethics? Now, that is the intention, ultimately.
And so, sorry, let me just finish, because one of the projects that we're doing is a project whereby we hope that anybody coming out of university having done an AI course will also have done an ethics course, or a course, at least one class, around social impact of the technology, so that we don't get the Chris Wileys of this world saying, this seemed like a really great thing to do, and I never thought about the consequences.
Yeah. So I just want to push back on that just a little bit. You know, obviously having an ethical center is what we want for everybody. However, one of the problems we face here is we don't know what we're doing. We don't know what the effects are. We don't know when we experiment with a new thing what these consequences are. We know there are always unintended consequences, but we've been remarkably unsuccessful at being able to do exactly as you asked, which is design and think ahead and plan ahead. And I guess the concern is you put in regulations in place that themselves have those same unintended consequences. So I'm a little skeptical about this idea that we, right at the stage when the technology is quite nascent, that we can do anything preemptive. I think actually we're probably better off putting our capabilities in to organisations to monitor what's going on so that we can identify problems and then solve them as they arise. I know that's not popular, you know, prevention's always better than a cure, but I think you do a cure when you don't know how to prevent.
I don't think you should conflate regulation with an ethical framework, however. Regulation, to me, is sometimes the innovation killer, if you like, when it's too detailed. I think what we're trying to do is talk about a broad ethical framework, so existing regulators pay heed to that, so people pay heed to the ethical framework on a voluntary basis, but it isn't some kind of granular, detailed regulation that is preventing people developing their technology.
So two things on that. I'd like to push back on that a little bit. You know, I think it was at Stanford that they developed this program that can identify whether you're gay or not. I wonder what the ethical framework and thinking was behind deciding that they would develop this artificial intelligence program, when knowing that can get you killed in some places in the world. And so, you know, that really suggests that there is a need for us to think before we go on and simply develop these fun science projects. The other piece that I was going to talk about is the regulation. Certainly regulation is thought to kill innovation, but in some cases you do need it. And so we are doing a project with 3 governments around the world, and actually I'll be talking about it with the Rwandan regulator this afternoon. So trying to think about how you might have a regulator who works with companies to certify product, as opposed to waits until something goes wrong. So you have the prevention, which also helps innovation, rather than the, well, we'll cure it after something went wrong attitude.
So it's excellent that you bring up the Gaydar paper, because what the researchers said is, well, it passed IRB. So it passed Stanford's existing guidelines for research, which really, and maybe I'm just going to light a bit of a match and then run off and watch it explode, is to say we need to reimagine governance, period. You know, I mean, this is the disruption we talk about when we talk about disruption. It's not always a comfortable disruption. Maybe we, to Joshua's point, like, need to just reimagine how we do governance. And I want to sort of put that out.
Well, I think all 3 of us, we seem to have little shades of difference on how far you can regulate in these circumstances. I believe in regulating when it's clearly seen to be an issue that needs regulating. So, for instance, on automated cars, we've got legislation at this moment going through Parliament. And I think, of course, you need to have standards that are adopted and so on and so forth to make sure you do then have innovation and development of new products, because then they've got a framework. But where there isn't a problem, and at the moment, you know, we don't know what the unintended consequences of some of the developments are, a framework, if you like, an ethical framework, I think is adequate until we see abuse of that. And it may be that that kind of development that we're talking about, that Kay's mentioned, is something that we need to start thinking about. I suspect that actually the use of the data sets themselves may have been in breach of people's privacy and so on and so forth. But I don't know the details of it. But I suspect that if it was the GDPR at play, which has only just come into effect, then that would be quite a serious breach of that. We shall see.
We should just remember that that was research being done. So the alternative thing to not doing that, let's think about what the alternative was. We have stricter guidelines, that research doesn't get done. The knowledge that, if it is the case, that you can actually scan faces and tell sexual orientation doesn't get widely known. But that research can still be done by those governments who think of it as a police issue. And then you can walk into it unwittingly. With this research done, you could actually walk in, how would you be able to traverse those countries and disguise things that might be like that. So, I mean, we have to, it's so hard to even, point to an issue that seems like a bright line and say, did we really not want that?
No, I mean, we really didn't want that, because that was a really good example, I think Kay's pointing out, of just bad science. Because there is no it's assuming there's a biological connection.
I agree.
When
If it's wrong, I'm skeptical on that front. But I'm just, remember the ethics committee is not going to approve whether it's right or wrong, but whether you should be trying at all. If it's wrong, we don't want any wrong science out there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. There is no biological basis, and the assumption of their paper is that there is a biological basis, right?
I'm not enough in the weeds to
those of us in the responsible AI community.
Well, I mean, none of us know what it was based on. Was it facial recognition signals?
It was actually scraped off of Tinder profiles. So GDPR, speaking of, with people's self-identified sexual orientations, which may or may not be correct, right, on Tinder, and then the machine learning algorithm just based its training model on that data. So there's many different layers to unpack with the correctness or incorrectness of their methods. But to your point, I think what you're raising here, which is a great issue, and I think after this I'll open it to Q&A from the audience. They seem quite eager. But your point, I believe, to rephrase, is that when we draw this line, who are we empowering and who are we then stifling? Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been such an informative panel. I really appreciate you taking your time. And thank you to the audience members. We'll be around for questions afterwards as well.